Hello again. Glad you have it with us on Deadline Now. I'm Jack Lessenberry. Paul Block, the former publisher of The Blade, would have turned 100 years old this spring. While he had a stronger influence on his newspaper than most publishers, he was virtually unique in that he also had two other major careers. He was an internationally renowned scientist who made pioneering breakthroughs in synthesizing thyroid compounds. And he was a civic activist who took a leading role in developing and redeveloping Toledo and Northwest Ohio. Joining us to take a look at the man and his legacy are two men who knew him well: Douglas Neckers, Chairman Emeritus of the Chemistry Department at Bowling Green State University, and Tom Walton, former editor of The Blade and host of a former incarnation of this program back when it was called The Editors. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us tonight.
Always a pleasure, Jack, to be with you.
Tom, Paul Block was more than just a newspaper publisher, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I knew him primarily in that role, but of course I was aware also of his accomplishments and achievements in the laboratory and all the hard work he had done on behalf of the city of Toledo and Northwest Ohio, as you mentioned in your opening. Very much an eclectic personality, fascinating and interesting man.
Now, there was a presumption on the part of some Toledoans that he micromanaged every last detail of the newspaper. Was that true?
Well, when I was working for Paul Block, I was principally on the city desk, the state desk, and for a time in the Columbus Bureau, and never had to deal with him on a daily basis, never got to deal with him on a daily basis. But I think that is overstated. We had good people working for him and that I worked for, but nevertheless, we were aware of his presence and had great admiration and respect for him.
Professor Neckers, how serious a scientist was Paul Block?
Paul Block was an excellent scientist. He was a scientist before he was a newspaper man. Paul took his undergraduate degree at Yale in 1933, and like organic chemists everywhere, started in the PhD program at Columbia, finished a year, then went to Harvard for a year, and then his father, he always called him his old man, called him to Toledo to run the paper during the Depression. But Paul was sufficiently serious about his research that he, during the early 1940s, took a leave from the paper, and he wrote a PhD dissertation at Columbia in 1942 on the chemistry of thyroxine. And I can continue with things about that later, but it was he was always very much in the forefront of thyroid gland understandings and chemistries.
Of course, organic chemistry is a very, very difficult and complex discipline.
Well, it's complex, there's no question. And one thing that I've found out in the last couple of years was that Paul dedicated his dissertation to a man from Yale who he knew by the name of Coghill, Robert Coghill. And Robert Coghill was a scientist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture laboratories in Peoria, Illinois, and they were studying there, developing technologies to use corn, as we still do today. And Coghill was one of the first people in the United States that the people that had penicillin virus, penicillin bacteria, were taken to in 1941. And out of that came the development of what was then the U.S. Department of Defense's penicillin initiative that led to penicillin for our troops in 1943.
Wow.
So Block was involved in that in ways I didn't know, actually.
You think of Alexander Fleming when you think about penicillin, and not a whole lot of other names.
Well, Fleming found the mold in 1929, but he couldn't find anybody to develop it. And it was brought to the United States in 1941 and ended up at, among other places, at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and from there led to a major initiative. There's a new novel, a historical novel about penicillin called Fierce Radiance that I can strongly recommend because it tells these stories. Little did I know that Paul Block was involved.
For heaven's sake, because well, Tom, he sort of kept the two halves of his life separate, didn't he?
Absolutely. We know he enjoyed immensely being in his laboratory at his home out on River Road, and he would come to the Blade occasionally, and when he did, it was always an occasion for the staff because we didn't see him that frequently. But we knew when he was there, and again, everybody had great respect for him. I remember the company purchased a newspaper in Monterey, California in the late 1960s. And
the Monterey
Peninsula Herald. And then in the early 1970s took over active management of it. And I remember that the folks in Monterey were a little taken aback perhaps that an organization in Toledo, Ohio had acquired their daily newspaper that had only one owner since its inception, like 60 years earlier. And so there was some concern about these folks from Toledo coming in. There were very few of us. Eventually I was sent out in 1975 to help in that effort. And I think what's interesting, though, is that if you look back now and talk to the folks who are still out there in Monterey, former colleagues of mine, they will tell you that that early misunderstanding was misplaced, that the best years of that newspaper's ownership they consider to be the Block years and the Paul Block years. And of course, the company no longer has that property, but they do look back fondly on those years.
You know, when we think of newspaper publishers these days, Tom, they're mainly folks concerned with the bottom line, the profit margins. In some cases, family-owned newspapers, they get involved in the editorial product, but Paul Block Jr., or PBJR, also was very keenly concerned with Toledo and Northwest Ohio as communities.
Absolutely. One of his earliest initiatives, after he became actively involved as publisher in the mid-1940s, about 1945, was to commission an exhibition called Toledo Tomorrow. Norman Belgettis, the nationally known designer, put it together, and it was exhibited at the Toledo Zoo, an immensely popular exhibition.
This was sort of a futuristic
look at how Toledo could look several decades down the road. And within 10 years of that very popular exhibit, we had a new Central Union train station, we had a new airport. Although in Norman Belgetti's design, the airport was to be located downtown.
Probably not a great idea.
Maybe not, but at any rate, it was a visionary look at the future and certainly one of the publisher's great initiatives.
Professor Neckers, how did you first come to meet Paul Block?
I don't really remember, except I was active in the American Chemical Society, and Paul was active in the American Chemical Society, and we were organic chemists, and I started talking to this man and found out later that he was publisher of the newspaper. And those of us in the sciences are always trying very hard to convince the young students of America to study chemistry, and I thought this was just a wonderful thing to nurture. And we became very good friends because we had numerous colleagues and friends that we knew mutually. Chemists. I'm not talking about anybody in politics. I'm talking about chemists.
Would this have been in the 60s when you first met him, 70s?
No, this would have been around 73, 74, something like that. And then we gave an honorary degree at Bowling Green to a very distinguished professor from Ohio State by the name of Professor Melvin Newman. Ohio State had a rule that they couldn't give honorary degrees to their own very distinguished faculty members, and I was called by the chair of the chemistry department at Ohio State, asked if we at Bowling Green could give Professor Newman an honorary degree. So I called Paul and I said, hey, Paul, we're giving Mel Newman an honorary degree. Would you join me in the academic procession? And he was absolutely thrilled, and he did, and it was a beautiful day, and Mel was honored, and he was a good friend. That's how I met Paul Block.
Now, he actually was a pioneer in inventing a compound that had medical effects, didn't he?
Right. He invented it, well, he synthesized, and he had a collaborator at the University of California at San Francisco, or in San Francisco, by the name of Eugene Jorgensen. And this was a pathologist or something like that, and he would send his compounds for testing. You know, chemists can make all sorts of things, but if you can't find somebody in the medical community to test them against a disease of some consequence, it's not worth much. So Paul had this collaborator, and they published jointly until the collaborator died very suddenly, while I knew him, actually. So, and he found a compound that was an analog and synthetic analog of thyroxine, and he became the world's supplier of that compound. So and I've looked at his
But what is this used for? What is thyroxine?
well, thyroid gland has all sorts of biologically important, physiologically important duties, and iodine is one of the things that is monitored or involved with thyroid metabolism. Yeah, iodine metabolism is thyroid controlled, and so it's used to control things that are not controlled by the body, in which thyroid hormone would control itself.
But Tom, he never trumpeted this in the newspaper, did he? Any of his scientific work was
not at all. It was a side of the man that many of us on the city desk and his young staff was vaguely aware of. We knew him primarily in his role as publisher. Over the years, I came to understand and appreciate that side of him. I always understood and very much appreciated as well that under his leadership, our newspaper, the Blade, maintained a strong international interest. Global involvement was very important to Paul Block. We may have been the smallest paper our size in the country to maintain a European-based foreign correspondent, Fernand de Bergenois, who was a close friend of Paul Block's and worked for our newspaper for many, many years.
And Paul spoke extremely fluent French, spent a lot of time in France.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think Fernand was Belgian, and but he traveled all over on the Blade's behalf, and that was quite, I would say, unusual, and even today would be quite unusual.
Even more unusual today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Remember the Blade sent him to China with Governor Rhodes when China first opened
absolutely.
up. But, you know, Paul Block, Tom, was not an uncontroversial figure, especially in regards to, you know, some of his civic activities. In fact, when I first came to Toledo, somebody said, oh, Toledo has a strong publisher form of government. To what extent was that criticism merited?
I think that's a description that people have some fun with, and I think we've heard it said of his son, John Robinson Block, our current co-publisher, and I think that goes with the territory. I think the city of Toledo, Northwest Ohio, was in need of an overhaul, development. A lot of changes were going on, and I think Paul Block, although he was basically what I would say a very shy man, recognized that he had a role to play. And I think because of his shyness, he wasn't always understood, and that might have led to this idea about the strong
So he was
publisher.
the one person who could be sort of an honest broker, was to
Exactly.
and a motivator. We need to take a moment here to let you know how to contact this program through our website here at WGTE. We'll be right back.
The views and opinions expressed in Deadline Now are those of the host of the program and its guests. They do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of WGTE Public Media. We encourage viewers to share their thoughts about our programs. Visit us at our website, wgte.org/deadline-now. View our past guests or leave us a message. Visit Deadline Now online at wgte.org/deadline-now.
Back on Deadline Now, talking about the life and legacy of Paul Block Jr., the longtime Blade publisher. Douglas Neckers, one thing that Paul Block was instrumental in accomplishing was the Medical College of Ohio, which is now, of course, part of the University of Toledo, but he was the main force in getting that built.
That's right, and you have to put this all in the context of the times. Remember, maybe it's not so well known, but in World War I, 30% of the deaths were from bacterial infections. So around the world, particularly in the countries that were involved in World War I, there were major efforts to deal with what became antibiotics. We've mentioned penicillin. The Germans studied very carefully the compounds that they were making as dyes and found the sulfa drugs. And at Yale, there was a major effort to study things like tuberculosis and other diseases that were scourges on humankind at the time, and Paul was certainly affected by this. So he had a strong interest in medical chemistry, medicinal chemistry per se. And I heard him often. He told me, I don't know how many times, when James Rhodes was running for governor in, I think, 1962.
Right.
He said candidate Rhodes called him to the then airport and said to Paul, what is it that Toledo really needs? And he looked him right in the eye and he said, a medical school. And as a result, at least from what I think I've heard afterwards, Paul endorsed Rhodes for governor of Ohio in the '62 election, and a medical school was ordained right around here very soon thereafter. I think the first graduating class was '64 or '65. But Paul was very proud of that, but very modest about it. He was extremely modest for his...
And Tom Walton, that took some guts to endorse Jim Rhodes, because the governor at the time, he was running against the incumbent governor, Mike DeSalle, who was a Toledoan.
Yeah, the Blade had its differences with Mike DeSalle, and Jim Rhodes was a consummate politician, and it's interesting, that story, because the fascinating follow-up to it is that several years later, in 1974, James Rhodes came back to try to re-win the governor's office against Jack Gilligan, who had just pushed through the first state income tax in the state's history, very controversial move. Well, the Blade's endorsement editorial in 1974 spent the first, I would say, 17, 18 inches praising Governor James A. Rhodes lavishly, and then at the very end of the piece, endorsing Jack Gilligan for the election. So I thought that reflected a very keen sense of loyalty on Paul Block's part, but on balance felt that it was time to go with Jack Gilligan, who ended up losing.
Yeah, it was a tremendous upset that Gilligan. The Blade, prior to Paul Block becoming publisher, had been a solidly Republican paper.
Yeah, in fact, for almost a century, the Blade had endorsed only Republicans, did not even endorse FDR. A lot of folks are very surprised to hear that. It was not until Adlai Stevenson ran a second time against Dwight Eisenhower in 1956 that the Blade broke with tradition and endorsed the Democrat. Now, over the years since, there have been many times where they've endorsed the Democrats. There have also been times when they've endorsed the Republicans.
Endorsed Ronald Reagan, which
Ronald
people
Reagan,
now don't tend to remember. George Bush in 1988.
The first George Bush.
First George Bush. Mm-hmm. So he made it a truly independent paper.
Exactly, and that was the whole point.
Douglas Neckers, as a non-newspaper person, but a consumer of news, what's your impression been of the Blade's editorial policies over the years?
Well, you know, I think the Blade is independent. I think it doesn't stand for to be characterized as anything with respect to political party, and I enjoy that. I also know that Paul was very. I think he had a lot of conversations about FDR, and there were some controversies involving Paul and Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Actually, his father and Franklin Delano were bitter enemies.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah,
okay.
It was.
Well, anyway, but I think that the editorial policy, and I want to speak about something else that the Blade did that really caught my attention, and that is that they had a chemistry reporter.
A full-time science correspondent based in Washington.
Chemistry. Paul would correct us there. I would say science, and he said chemistry.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, as a scientist, how important that was to those of us who were trying to establish university-level research and development in the physical sciences here in Northwest Ohio.
And of course, over time, that person became known as our science editor.
Right.
And we had great ones. Ray Bruner. And much later, Mike Woods. In fact, Paul Block called Mike Woods the best science writer in the country, and there are a lot of us at the Blade who shared that opinion.
And I think that that's absolutely right. Mike is now with the American Chemical Society, but I always could count on things that Michael Woods wrote that would teach me something as a research scientist, and that really, he found, for instance, the decomposition, the publication about the decomposition of the freons in the upper atmosphere to control or destroy the ozone layer. And I happen to know the professor who won the Nobel Prize for that chemistry, and he targeted Mike Woods as being a man who read his publications and then published those in the newspaper.
And most scientists, when they think about newspaper coverage of science, roll their eyes or worse.
Right, but it was not the case here. It was really well done and carefully done, and Paul himself was involved in it.
You know, Tom, the Blade has taken a lot of criticism since for many, many years it's been a monopoly newspaper. I guess the only real competitor to the Newsbee folded in 1938. The Times, which lasted till '75, was a subsidiary. Was Paul Block concerned at all about the fact that he had a monopoly business?
I think while it was true that for all those years we were the major daily newspaper, the only major daily newspaper, I think he also felt that it gave him a certain obligation, a certain responsibility to work hard on the community's behalf, whether it be investigative reporting or, as Doug has explained, the medical college, Toledo Lucas County Port Authority, all of those things. He didn't have to pursue them. He could have stayed in his laboratory, but he had a sense of civic duty that was totally unrelated to any feeling of monopoly ownership. That's why I enjoyed my 42 years with the company, because unlike the Knight Ritters and Gannett's of the world, where the bottom line is paramount, I could count on our newspaper. You know, investigative reporting was what it was all about, and that philosophy was instilled in the new generation with John Robinson Black, with our Tiger Force winning the Pulitzer Prize, and CoinGate. I mean, those are things that would not have surfaced but for the Blade.
It wasn't just investigative reporting, though. It was interpretive reporting, analytical reporting,
Absolutely.
and trying to inform the public.
Yeah, we have a section in Sunday called Behind the News, and that's exactly what it is. We were expected to generate stories, as I was as a young reporter, for Sunday to help the reader understand what we were reporting on a daily basis.
Paul was an intellectual. I mean, he really was a very interesting person to talk to. And that led to him recruiting and retaining very, very active and interesting people. And I think that's the secret of any organization, and certainly the secret of the Blade as I know it.
You know, when I was a young reporter, he would talk to me sometimes, and he told me once that I asked him, asked him why he became a newspaper publisher, since chemistry was his paramount interest, and he said it was because his father died. His father died in 1941. He was 30 years old. He was the eldest son. He felt he had an obligation. Did he ever talk about that with you?
Well, he talked about his father's death and the trauma that caused for him and the difficulty with the estate and things of those sorts, but not necessarily that specific matter.
Do you think Tommy would have preferred just to have had a life dedicated to science?
I'm not sure what he would have preferred. I know that he, again, felt duty-bound, called to take on the mantle of leadership for the daily newspaper, and while he might have, his first love may have been the laboratory, I think he was also an outstanding publisher and journalist.
He did more, I think, for chemistry as a public citizen than most anybody in that generation.
By informing people about it?
By taking positions, by providing leadership. He also was he would have been very happy to do what I did, be a professor someplace in chemistry. But he was very active in promoting those things that science could contribute in a positive way to society, and so leaves a very excellent legacy in my
opinion. In terms of science, I want to ask you both this in a slightly different way. Next year it'll be a quarter century since he was gone. Does he have a lasting legacy?
His publication, he told me once that, you know, as far as dedicating buildings, he said, my legacy are my publications. And he does. He has. I've trailed his publications just recently because of
scientific publications.
Yes. Yeah.
Tom, what do you think his legacy is in terms of the city and in terms of the newspaper?
I think that Paul Block Jr., it's hard for me, first of all, to imagine that this is the 100th anniversary of his birth here in 2011. But I think his legacy is one of quality journalism, investigative journalism, analytical journalism, and in fostering those same values in his sons and this generation of leadership at the Blade. The newspaper business is evolving, as you well know, and whatever form it's going to take, I'm just pleased that we have the same family leading us through that time.
That's wonderful. Well, I don't know if we've done justice to Paul Block's career, but we have run out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation. Tom Walton, Dr. Neckers, thanks for being with us tonight on Deadline Now. I'm Jack Lessenberry, and I'll be back with some final thoughts in a moment. For some reason, Paul Block Jr., or PBJR as he was known in the office, took a liking to me when I was a young reporter at the Blade in the late 70s and early 1980s. I think it was because I could speak some French, and he took that to mean I was intelligent. I did my best not to allow him to discover the truth. I cannot claim to have known him as well as some people did, although from time to time he would have serious discussions with me. He was remarkable in a number of ways, in addition to all those we've been discussing tonight. Even in his time, newspapers were mostly owned by large groups or chains, and the men who ran them were all about making money, as much as possible. That's not how Paul Block saw the world. Once, someone told him he could double the newspaper's profits if he was willing to do certain things, including cutting down on quality. He told the man he wasn't interested, that the paper made enough for him. He saw journalism as being something different than making and selling a product. He believed newspapers had a responsibility to their communities to try to make them better places to live. You could disagree with what he thought the best way to do that was, and many people did. Nobody, however, could accuse Paul Block of not caring about Toledo. Some of his attempts at downtown redevelopment didn't succeed in the long run. Others, however, such as the former Medical College of Ohio, now part of the University of Toledo, and the Yamasaki-designed Government Center, added greatly to this community. Paul Block was anything but perfect. He could be eccentric, irascible, hard-headed, and didn't always suffer fools gladly. But he maintained and set a standard for journalism in this area that continues to be impressive. He was a man who made a career of seeing ahead of his time, whether in the field of atomic energy or in recognizing how corrupt the Nixon administration was. The Blade won a Pulitzer Prize and came close to 2 others in recent years for doing quality journalism of a kind few papers of its size would even attempt. Paul Block was long dead when this happened, but he left a legacy that led to that work, and some of us still miss him. I hope you'll be back with us here next time. For Deadline Now, I'm Jack Lessenberry.